So first, how do we get into this? Our movement in the 1940s made a series of devastating decisions that were mistakes that we're living with today. And this is not in order of importance, but the first one, the failure to organize the South. Now, there was an attempt, albeit brief, from about 1946 to 47-8 to organize part of the South. It was called Operation Dixie. But it failed almost before it started. There was not a full commitment by the AFL or the CIO, or later the AFL-CIO, to organize the South. And what's interesting is that this failure to organize the South and to appreciate why the South needed to be organized happens at the same time that a movement is starting to develop in the South that ends up changing the United States. And one has to ask oneself the question, what could have happened if organized labor had actually fused with the Black freedom movement in the 1940s and 50s? What this country would look like? What would be the red states and what would be the blue states? What we would actually be looking at. In the 1940s, when Black veterans returned from World War II, they came back loaded for bear, literally and figuratively. And they were not going to take Jim Crow segregation, and they helped us set in motion some things that had been percolating in the 1930s. And we had the modern Black freedom movement. Organized labor largely ignored this. There were certain unions that got involved. But to a great extent, by the late 1940s, most of organized labor took the position that that was not the activity of labor. It was not about wages, hours, and working conditions, which is what unions are supposed to focus on, apparently. So we missed this opportunity. And given that unions are almost the only institution in the society that brings people together across racial boundaries, one has to think again what the South might have looked like, what the Southwest might have looked like, and what the political dynamics in this country would have been. But we blew it. Second, the Taft-Hartley Act. Well, we all know that labor opposed the Taft-Hartley amendments. But what we don't appreciate are many of the ramifications. And I don't mean just the restrictions on unions in terms of the ability to strike and organize and the various tactics, but the red clauses. The red clauses which were used to eliminate from the union movement anyone who was accused of being a communist, which ultimately meant the purging of unions, throwing unions out of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, as well as throwing good activists out, decommissioning people, wholesale. Thousands and thousands of people were thrown out. In fact, some of the people that had been instrumental in building the CIO in the 1930s were expelled. And when that happened, part of what we have to understand is that many of these people that were expelled were the people that helped to orient the union movement to be more than just simply about collective bargaining, but to be about economic justice, about social movements. These people were eliminated, and they were eliminated, and when they were eliminated, the leaders of the CIO and the AFL thought that this concession to capital had been enough to guarantee our continued existence, and that it turns out to have been an absolute failure. A third mistake was roughly 1950, if I'm not mistaken. It's called the Treaty of Detroit. What this was the United Auto Workers essentially abandoned the fight for national health care. Now, many people don't realize that after World War II, everybody expected that we were going to have national health care, that we were going to be like most of the rest of humanity, right? And that we would have, in civilization, we'd have national health care. By the late 1940s, conservative forces pushed back on this. The UAW made a fateful decision, and that decision was that that collective bargaining would be the framework in which workers would gain benefits, like pensions and health care. That it wouldn't be a fight that we took on with the state, with the government. It would be handled with employers. Now, that decision is not irrational. It was wrong, but it's not irrational. It's not irrational because we represent 35% of the workforce. So you could say, well, we'll do that and it sets a pattern. The problem is when you're 12% of the workforce, you're not setting any kind of patterns. And our failure, our abandoning of that, also coincided with this other thing that I mentioned. It was the abandoning of the role of the unions as vehicles for the fight for economic justice. Let me just elaborate that last part for a second. A few months ago, I was on a plane, and I was sitting next to this guy, and we just started chatting, and I worked into the discussion that I had written a book. And just like David, I'm sure, is always figuring out ways of pushing his music, as an author, you have to always push your book. You have to figure out every opportunity. So I was telling him about, I wrote this book about unions, the one that just came out, the bankrupting list. And he said, oh, unions, they're not bad. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Well, that's, that these days, that's not bad to hear, right? And then I listened to him, and then he said the following. He said, but the problem is, sometimes I think unions are too strong. Too strong. And I'm sitting there, like, looking at this guy. Did the plane just depressurize itself? I mean, too strong, right? I mean, just think about it. With 12% of the non-agricultural workforce. 12%. In 1952, there were 479 major work stoppages. In 2009, there were 5. 5. That's not because things are getting better. Workers are getting fired every day for organizing. I'm trying to figure out, how could this guy think that we're too strong? So I listened to him because he wasn't a reactionary. I wasn't talking to Bill O'Reilly or something, right? I was listening to this guy, and I was listening to him talk about how angry he was with the economic polarization that we're facing. He was pissed. And then dawn broke on Marblehead for me, and I realized what was going on. He sees the extent of the economic injustice in our society and doesn't think that unions are relevant at all to addressing it. In fact, he looks at us the same way you would look at a lobby like the National Rifle Association. That you'd look at them and say, they're good for their members, they look out for their members, but they're not particularly good for the rest of us. They don't really care about the rest of us. They care about their members. Well, if you're talking about a lobby, that's expected, but we're not supposed to be a lobby. We're supposed to be a social movement. And the fact that this man saw no connection between us and the fight for economic justice is potentially our epitaph. See, if we are not able to close the chasm between the fight for economic justice and unions, we have no future. None. We're history. If people, when they are suffering, don't say, we need a union, we have no future. And that is our challenge. I'm not prepared to put that yet on a tombstone. But I am saying that that is our challenge. That every day we've got to be thinking about that man on the plane. We've got to be thinking, how do we bring that connection together between the fight for economic justice? Millions of workers out there that want economic justice. Think about the support that the Occupy movement had. People want economic justice. But the fact is, when they don't think about us, or if they think about us and think about us in negative terms, then we know that we've got a major problem in store for us. So the implications of all of this simply can't be overstated. And so the question then we have is what do we do? And I was in thinking about the speech, I had some very specific ideas I was going to lay out, but which I may do, depending on how much time I have. But what I really want to get to is something that I started talking with Jim about in the ride here. We are in a situation with corporate America of what's called asymmetric warfare. And what that basically means is one side has all the guns and planes and tanks, and the other side has mortars, some rifles, a few machine guns, and some hand grenades. And that one side that has a few rifles has decided that it doesn't want to surrender. That's asymmetric. We're in that situation. And when you're in a situation of asymmetric warfare, you simply cannot fight the way we once did. Let me give you a historical example. In 1940, the Germans invaded France. And the French General Staff, which was actually more interested in suppressing the French working class than in fighting the Germans, their entire strategy was focused on using techniques from World War I. Now, the Germans had no interest in using the techniques from World War I. Why? Because they lost the war, right? Knock, knock. So they decided, the Germans introduced new strategies. And central to that was this notion of the Blitzkrieg. So they moved in, they demoralized the French, and they defeat the French. Now, at that moment, there were three basic options that the French had. They could become collaborationists like Pétain, and so support the Vichy. And a lot more French than history acknowledges went that route. Another route, which was very, very important, was to follow Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle, who was a tank commander, went to Britain and made a very stirring radio address saying it was right for people to resist the Germans. So some French crossed the English Channel and went to join him. There's a third option. It was the option of the Maquis, the guerrillas. The guerrillas who were led by the communists and the socialists, the partisans in France that kept fighting the Germans. Now, the Maquis no longer had tanks, they didn't have planes, they didn't have any sophisticated weapons, but they had decided that it was critical to resist. In other words, they had to completely rethink their strategy. Completely and totally. Our movement has not yet come to that point, by and large. We are trying desperately, we're grasping at different possibilities, but we haven't accepted a fundamental thing, which is that we have suffered a major defeat. And in response to that, you have to change your strategy, or you will be eliminated. That's what the French Maquis understood. That indeed is what de Gaulle understood. We're in that situation where a different brand of trade unionism is demanded of us. Now, I realize that this is very difficult because most of us have been brought up in a certain brand of trade unionism where we're told that it's basically, you're struggling for the best contract, you're struggling to represent the workers who are lucky enough to be in your union, you're fighting for more, or you're fighting just to stay even. I know that. That's what we were brought up in. The problem is, it ain't working. It's simply not working. And we've got to look around and understand that since we are in this asymmetric situation, our strategy needs to change. But here's the other part, which is what is very exciting. There's a lot of people on the outside that think along the lines that we do, that want the kind of change that we do, but don't know where to go. I'll just give you one small example, which may sound a bit bizarre. A couple of years ago, Bill O'Reilly, he and Ann Coulter, these people I love to hate. And so Bill O'Reilly was talking about this poll that had been taken. And he said, and the poll said, 7 out of 10 people in the United States prefer capitalism as an economic system. And he was saying, oh, this is great, right? Well, there's another way of looking at that poll. I mean, 3 out of 10 don't. Now, what's 3 out of 10 in a country of more than 300 million people? It means 100 million people have a problem with this system. Now, just think about that for a second. 100 million people. Right now, our union movement is 16 million people. So, we have, what, 82 million more that we could get right now that should be sympathetic to our cause. That's the way we've got to start thinking. We've got to be thinking about 100 million people. We've got to be thinking about the people that are not in our ranks, that are out there that are desperate for economic justice. We've got to think about ways of bringing them in, but also changing the way that we operate. And this is particularly important when it comes to young people. That this movement is aging out. And too few of our leaders are paying any attention to bringing forward younger people. And it gets really embarrassing. I'm 59 years old, and I walk into some meetings and people say, I'm glad that the youth is here. Now, look, hey, I'm glad I look young and I hope I look good, but I ain't young. But yet I have a movement that thinks in those terms. They're not thinking about younger people younger than 40, let alone younger than 30. And we have a movement that's not accommodating itself to younger people. You know, many of us that are baby boomers and older, we keep getting into the same old tired thing. And you know, I have this little thing I tell people that if you want to guarantee that you get rid of young people, if you want to do like an agent cleansing, right? And you just say, I'm tired of these young people. All you have to say is the following, and it will guarantee they won't be back. And it goes like this. That's not the way we do it here. That's all you need to say. That's all you need to say. And you say that and they're gone. See, and I was saying to some people earlier, in my generation, when older people would be getting in the way, what we did is we just moved them aside and took over, right? Took over stages, took over organizations, everything, right? Younger people these days, they don't necessarily do that. They just disappear. And then older people have the audacity to say, we're the young people. They're apathetic. No. We have blocked them. And the thing is that if we are going to survive as a movement, we cannot block young people. We've got to figure out ways of engaging them, being willing to change. And it doesn't mean that everything that younger people do is right, but it means that they have their own ways and that we need to treat them with respect and engage in a dialogue. And it's through that dialogue that we're going to grow. But this whole notion that they've got to pay their dues. I've been reading the biography of Rosa Parks that Jean Theoharis wrote, which I strongly recommend. And I just keep remembering how young the leaders of the civil rights movement were. And they weren't called kids. Like King was 25. And it wasn't like he led the Southern Youth Christian Leadership Conference, right? It was Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was recognized as a leader. And you look, leader after leader, these younger people that were there, and they weren't treated as kids. And if there was an attempt to treat them as kids, the people that tried to do that were knocked out of the way. We have to understand that this movement can't continue going on as it is. So we've got to change, and it's going to be painful. It's going to be difficult. But the bottom line is that it's essential. Let me just suggest this in moving towards a landing. In the great HBO series, Band of Brothers, about the 101st Airborne Division, I always like to tell this story because it really struck me when I watched this episode of it. It's about during World War II, and in the second or third episode, the replacements are coming up to the front, and they run across this veteran of the Normandy invasion. And the veteran says to them, "You're nervous, aren't you?" And they say, "Yes." And he says, "That's because you don't realize you're already dead." I said, "Ooh." And he says, "Once you realize that you're dead, you can fight the Germans. As long as you think you're alive, you're not going to be able to fight them." Now, when I watch this, I'm saying, wow, that is like really heavy, right? But I realized he wasn't suggesting that they become kamikazes. He was saying something very important and extremely relevant to our moment here. He was basically saying that when you go into battle, if your main preoccupation is saving yourself, you can't fight the enemy. You're going to be ducking, jumping into holes, doing everything you can. You'll be surrendering in order to avoid getting killed. That when you go into battle, when you leave a sign that you may or may not survive, you're able to fight the enemy. I would suggest to you that the transformation of our movement begins with the following. We're already dead. We're already dead. And now, with that recognition, we can actually adopt the audacity to go out and fight our opponents. That we can actually have the audacity to go out and flip the script. That we can actually have the audacity to not dwell on whether we're having coffee or tea with the governor of Illinois or the president of the United States. We can have the audacity to say that that's not really that important. That what is important is my ability as a union leader to mobilize my members, to mobilize my potential members, to mobilize our supporters, and to raise holy hell. That is what's important. Because ultimately, it's not about holding our own. It is about fundamentally eliminating the opponents, our opponents, and eliminating those opponents who are standing in defense of economic injustice. That is what confronts us. And we will have that audacity when we recognize that there is absolutely, at this point in history, not a damn thing we have to lose. We have an amazing amount to actually win. Thank you very much.
All right, everybody. Is this mic on? No. I don't need a mic, do I?
No!
I didn't think so. Bill Fletcher, everybody. I wonder if while he was standing up here saying that we are dead, he noticed that it says, pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living right behind him. That's inspirational. Couple things. Hey, I've got juice again. I didn't really need it though, did I? We have a couple of announcements. Passing the hat tonight, we came up with $589. Great on you. Good on.
Fast food workers strikes, along with the Walmart organizing, I think have been two very, very exciting developments. And they're challenging on a number of levels. There's a lot of support that exists within the union movement for these strikes. But so the objective, here's the challenge in terms of the fast food strikes. There were attempts about 30 years ago to organize fast food on some scale. It was Acorn that set up something called the United Labor Unions that was doing it. And one of the things that they ran up against was that they organized places fairly successfully, but the turnover of the workforce made it very difficult to get a contract. So one of the challenges in terms of current fast food organizing is what actually ends up being the objective. Now, if the objective is not so much a contract with a particular employer, but perhaps citywide agreements, then I think that this is like incredibly powerful. So that's one of the things I think, one of the reasons I think it's really important for this to be supported. A second challenge is that much of this has been supported by SEIU. And there's a certain irony there, since that's not part of their core industry. And Andy Stern made that so central when he split the AFL-CIO. But we'll leave that aside, and we'll say that, but the question, however, is this. If they're going to do this, how long will they stay with this? See, because when you throw people in the battle, you can't throw people in the battle and then change your mind later. If you're going to throw people in the battle, you better stay there to make sure that they have the support that they need when there is a counterattack. Because if you don't, our reputation plummets. Right? People will feel that they were suckered. So what I'm hoping is that SEIU is actually making a long-term commitment to this, as opposed to that this is just a temporary thing. In much the same way that the UFCW has been making this long-term commitment to Walmart. recognizing that organizing Walmart, which I would argue is the Ford Motor Company of our era, and I'll explain that in 1 second, is critically important and is not going to happen overnight. And that we have to make, there has to be a long-term commitment to doing that. And I think USW is making that commitment, and I'm supporting them. Now, what I mean by they're the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford was a brilliant fascist. He really was, and he wasn't crude either. He was brilliant on so many levels, but one is that he understood what he introduced in Ford with the assembly line, the process of production, was something that ended up getting emulated throughout industries. But the other part of what Ford did was that he raised the wage level of the workers so that they could afford to buy things. It was really quite visionary. But the question that always intrigued me is, why was the UAW having such problems unionizing Ford? And that's because Ford, in many ways, was the ideological precursor of the Walton family. That what Ford did was that he understood the issue of divide and conquer. So what he was willing to do, which many other employers weren't, was to hire black workers. And he hired black workers, and then he basically cultivated a relationship with black ministers in Detroit. And in many cases, people got jobs in Ford through their ministers. Well, this ended up obstructing the union organizing. So while the UAW was able to succeed in GM and Chrysler, they couldn't break Ford. And the other thing about Henry Ford, which many people don't know, is that he helped to publish and introduce in the United States a very notorious document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was this document that was basically created by the Tsar's secret police in order to attack Jews. I mean, this man was not a nice guy, but he was very shrewd. He gave laboratory space to George Washington Carver and made sure that black newspapers would talk about that. Much the same as the Walton family is doing today, with the way that they've cultivated various organizations and communities of color as if to say that they really understand us. So part of what we have to understand is what the UAW did to unionize Ford. And what they did was that they actually made it a community campaign. And they united with organizations like the NAACP and the National Negro Congress in order to win over the workers at Ford. Much the same is going to have to be done with Walmart. So that's a long answer to your question, so forgive me.